Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me welcoming you here in the lovely premises of Campus Hybernská. The project of the same name, Campus Hybernská, has a very ambitious goal to bring together people that like culture, science, that are innovators, that bring experience from abroad. The last is especially valid for our Café Collaborations that brings together people with expertise from abroad together with our Czech experts. Today we meet already for the 5th time, and it's also thanks to the excellent cooperation with the German embassy here in Prague and with their kind support. So I will now pass the floor to Madame Anglum from the embassy that will also welcome you here. Thank you and look forward to passing a nice evening with you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome here to the Café Collaboration about the topic gender and climate. You might think that it's that we try to combine two topics that are not by any chance related to each other, but that's not true. Gender inequality and climate are very closely linked to each other. According to UN Women, women are much more affected by climate change than men. So we just wanted to find out what it's really about, and that's why we invited two young researchers, Eva from the Charles University Environment Center and Maximilian from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, to discuss about this topic and for us to learn more about the connection between those two topics. I would like to thank very much Campus Hybernská for organizing this nice event, a series of events with us together from German Embassy. And I would also like to thank Adela Jurečková from the Heinrich Böll Foundation for the co-organization of this event and also for the moderating. And so I pass on to you, Adela, and I wish you a very nice evening and a fruitful discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, also from my side. As you've heard, my name is Adela Jurečková and I'm the director of the Prague office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and we are a green German foundation and a partner of today's event. And I'm very glad that the German embassy has invited us to collaborate on this event because it combines issues that are very important for us as a foundation, which is climate change, gender inequalities, and inequalities in general. And it's also topics that spark a lot of debate in this country, as you know. So I'm also looking forward to a very lively debate this evening. Looking into the room, I'm also happy that there are many people who are interested in this issue, because climate change, as Anne Gloom said, hasn't been linked to gender inequalities for a long time. It was maybe seen as two topics which have not much to do with each other, and we have always seen this link at the HBS, but I noticed that it's more and more seen also in politics, in media, and also in the public. So thanks for being here and being interested in it. I would like to, of course, introduce our dear guests and speakers first, and I'll start with Eva Zvěřinová. She is an environmental scientist, sociologist, to be precise. She also teaches this subject at the Charles University in Prague. And besides that, she works as a researcher at the Environment Center of the Charles University and the Center for Socioeconomic Research on Environmental Policy Impact Assessment at the Czech Academy of Sciences. And in her research, Eva focuses on public preferences towards different climate policies and the possibilities to change behaviors of people in order to reduce their negative impact on the environment, for example, consumption habits. So that's something I would really like to hear more about, because I think it's very hard to change that. And And our second speaker and guest is Maximilian Kotz. He is a climate physicist. He holds a master's in theoretical physics and also environmental economist at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, which is one of the leading research centers in this area. And his research there focuses on the socioeconomic impacts of climate change. He's working, for example, with historical data to identify vulnerabilities to weather extremes in the past and also today. And he's projecting future impacts with physical models. So that's also, so it sounds very exciting, and I'd like to hear more later. And that's why I would first like to turn to you and ask you about your research and your work, because it sounds really impressive and also maybe unusual when I see your backgrounds, because climate change and environment have for a long time been seen rather as an issue or as a problem of natural sciences, I would say, as something to measure, to track, to predict, and not so much as an issue for social sciences or an intersection of both in ideal case. But you are both focusing also on the social aspects of it, which I think is at least equally important. And I would like to know how have you discovered this perspective for yourself? Maybe to start with Maximilian, you are a theoretical physicist, as I said, originally from Great Britain. So how did you end up in Germany studying impacts of climate change on people, which is a very, very different thing at the end? And looking back, was it a good decision? Do you miss the British humor, for example, or do you think that maybe staying with natural sciences would have been better for you?
Yeah, British cuisine, maybe not, yeah. Not sure what that even really is. Thanks for the question, and thanks for everyone for being here today. It's a pleasure to be able to talk. And maybe a good moment to answer this question as well. Yesterday I defended my PhD thesis, so I'm in the process of reflecting on my... Thank you. That was not necessary. But just to say, it's a good moment to reflect on maybe the decisions I've made in the past sort of years, because in some sense I am a long way from home, I guess, having studied physics. I always had an interest in the climate change problem. Physical climate science I always found very, very interesting, and I sort of did my best to try and get research experience in that regard while I was doing my bachelor's and my master's. And I actually initially intended to do a PhD in just physical climate science. I had an offer to do so in the US, and I had quite short notice actually changed my mind, partly motivated by not wanting to move to the US and realizing that at very, very last notice. I think for a lot of people who work on the topic of climate change, it's not only motivated by an interest in the subject in sort of an inherent sense, but also with some kind of maybe altruistic motivation or interest in it as a problem from a sort of societal perspective. And that was something I was beginning to realize that was an angle that I wanted to relate to in my work, not just working on, say, like the mechanisms of the ocean and whatever, these minor details, which are very important, but wanting to work somehow in relation to what is this problem, what is it actually that we're facing, and what we can do about it. So then, yeah, this institute in Germany, the Potsdam Institute, was sort of set up kind of with that in mind, and there were opportunities there to go. And so I went there with not very much background really in the sort of socio-economic disciplines, which might be surprising, but I think one can pick up a fair degree as you go if you have a certain background in statistics or whatever. And so I was able to engage in the methods used by economists and things like this. And it's been a good decision. I'm very glad to have done what I've done and made that sort of step towards an interdisciplinary research.
So is the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and particularly interdisciplinary space? Do you have a lot of diversity there when it comes to backgrounds where people come from, also the gender balance maybe, and also different disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, with regard to the disciplines, people sometimes joke that it's meant to be an interdisciplinary research institute, and it does work on interdisciplinary topics, but it's quite dominated in terms of fields, actually, by people with a natural science background, in particular maths, engineering, or physics. That's partly because of how the institute was set up. It was set up by people with those kind of backgrounds, aiming to work and apply those kind of methods to topics of relevance to climate change broadly, both natural science and otherwise, but using those methods. But there is a push within the institute. They realise the necessity of bringing in these different perspectives, and increasingly, particularly they've done well in bringing in more sort of formal economists and things into the picture, and some sociologists. I've got one friend who she sort of describes herself as the only social scientist researcher who's actually a social scientist at the Potsdam Institute, which is quite funny. So there's still, yeah, in that sense, in terms of backgrounds, there's still a bit of a gap in terms of the interdisciplinary nature of the backgrounds. But I think that they're trying to do more, because it is important, obviously, to bring in these different perspectives. With regards to the sort of gender dimension of diversity, at the PhD level now, it's actually, things have improved quite a lot. I think it's roughly 50-50. I heard they did some surveys recently, and that's very good. That's a big improvement. But as you start to look up the sort of like the levels of hierarchy within the institute, that changes quite dramatically, quite quickly. And so, I mean, maybe it's just that it takes time for that to filter through, but also there's obviously some sort of like structural barriers to women attaining positions of seniority as well, which are still probably present.
Yeah, that's a typical problem. Maybe we can also let Eva tell us something about how it looks at the Academy of Sciences and the Charles University, but considering the balance of genders and backgrounds and all Max was speaking about. But I would also like to ask you, as I have asked him first, like, what was your path to studying environmental sociology and also having a strong background in economy and economical science? So it's something which is not that usual yet in Czech Republic, to combine all these subjects. Maybe now, but maybe a couple of years ago it wasn't. At least that's my impression. How did you end up where you are now? And was it a good step? Is it a good place for you as a researcher, as a woman, is the background of Czech academic institutions welcoming to female scientists, also with an interdisciplinary background?
So good afternoon. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I started to study sociology at Charles University, Faculty of Arts, and first what I discovered was Ulrich Beck and his theory of risk society, which attracted me to Ludwig Maximilian Universität in München, where I went hopefully to see his lectures, but unfortunately at that time he was teaching at London School of Economics, so finally accidentally I didn't meet him. I met another really great professor, Van Loon, and I've found the research on risk really interesting, and I started also like wonder about changing behavior at that time, because that was mainly like focus, because I'm already getting old also, so I observe it already for some years, but it was not like enough for me, so I went more to policies and climate policies, and what kind of measures would be actually effective and efficient, and then I ended up with a PhD on PhD studies on climate policy acceptability. So how people would accept support and why, and which factors would lead them to support more climate policies, and comparing this with other European countries, because we work usually on European projects. We have several Horizon 2020 projects at our research center. Yes, so at the Environment Center, we are actually mostly social scientists, though from completely different fields. We have in our team economists, we have one lawyer, we have now few sociologists, except me, we hired recently a few more. And we have also some experts on psychology, and then just few natural scientists. So it's quite diverse there in this respect.
And maybe let's move to the topic itself with the first block of questions, which would be about the impact of climate change on women and other groups, especially those who are vulnerable and disadvantaged. I would maybe start with a question towards you, the public, so that you don't come to word only at the end. And when I say it's probably not a surprise to any one of you that women and children are more affected by climate change than men. But my question would be, what is your guess? How much % of people that are displaced worldwide due to the effects of climate change are female? Because displacement is one of the biggest effects that we see due to climate change. No, actually, thanks for the microphone. But I should have said that I would only ask you for your guess by raising hand, so that we know, okay, how severe do you think this problem is? So to repeat the question, how much % of people that are displaced worldwide due to the effects of climate change are women? And the two possibilities would be 60% or 80%. So who thinks that it's 60%? Raise your hand. Okay. We have a few hands, but not so many. Who thinks it's 80%? Okay, that's really much more. Much more of you think it's 80%, and you are right, unfortunately. According to UN estimates, it's 80% of women who are displaced due to the effects of climate change in the world, and that's a immensely huge number. And it's hard to imagine why such a big difference would occur at the first moment. But since you also either research on that yourself or it's a part of the research you're dealing with, I would like to ask you, why is that? Like, could you name some like most important or most striking reasons why women are so much more severely affected by climate change than men? And it's up to you who would like to start.
Okay, I can start. Just to say that we asked each other this question earlier, and I got it wrong. Because with displacement, it's quite interesting. It's definitely one of the major effects of climate change, but it's also in some sense it's sort of an adaptive response to an impact in some sense. Like, so initially there'll be a certain set of vulnerabilities to climate change impacts. People's livelihoods will be affected, and then migration or displacement is ultimately like a secondary effect of those, and those secondary effects can be determined by like many different factors, often like resource availability. And so my intuition was that one of the major reasons that women are more vulnerable to climate impacts in general is the sort of overlap with pre-existing poverty distributions and income distributions, and I think it's like 70% of the people who are living in poverty globally are women. And then often like lack of resources is one of the reasons that people are unable actually to then move themselves out of a region where they are experiencing impacts. So I thought this could be a potential mechanism, actually suggesting it the other way around, but I'm clearly wrong. But in terms of vulnerability to climate impacts in the first place, there's clear reasons why women, particularly in the developing world, are more vulnerable, and it's often to do with like the roles and and responsibilities that they have in those societies, like the sort of working opportunities and what they typically do in, say, in terms of their households. And I think it's typically the case that they're more involved in lower skilled working activities, like related either to like collecting water, collecting fuel in relation to, say, household activities, or in terms of work, essentially subsistence farming. They're much more likely to be doing this kind of farming where it's just for their own consumption, in comparison to men who've maybe had the opportunity to get some form of skills to engage in other forms of labour. Where agriculture is, for sort of natural reasons, one of the more vulnerable sectors, so to say, to climatic impacts. Like if there are droughts, other forms of extreme weather events, agriculture is one of the first sectors that gets most strongly affected. And if more women are working in these fields and they don't have the skills to shift their work into other fields, then they're more likely to be negatively affected. I saw a study recently looking at, in India, for example, in India, when droughts occur there, the number of days that people are able to work during those droughts, it decreases by about 10% more for women in comparison to men, because this study seemed to conclude they don't have the available set of skills necessarily to transfer to other forms of work. So I think that's like kind of a main dimension along which that greater vulnerability of women arises.
Okay, thank you. What you described mostly applies to the global south, I guess, also the examples you mentioned. But then I would like to ask Eva if you would say that greater vulnerability of women towards the effects of climate change is also an issue in Czech Republic, which is a country in the global north, which is of course wealthier than the countries in the global south, and also more egalitarian. Maybe that there are definitely huge problems still when it comes to social inequality and inequality between women and men, but compared to the global south, it's much less. So how do you see it here? Is it an issue?
Yeah, I agree that definitely here are better doing in terms of inequalities, right, than in developing countries, especially in global south, right? But still we can expect some actually differences in the impacts on according to gender. There is already plenty of studies from Europe which dealt with the impact of heat waves and observed that the mortality of women is larger than of men after the heat wave. So there is recently, actually from last year, a study conducted in the Netherlands where they estimated this is for elderly women. It's like about 75 plus in Spain, France and Italy, and about 80 plus in the Netherlands. Though, because there are studies in these southern European countries, we would not be surprised, right? Because of the heat waves are more common there. But also now we have some evidence from the moderate climate country like the Netherlands. So I think in future we can expect more such an impact. Also, much more research is needed in this field because we lack data on these gender differences a lot. I now summarized like 9 studies. There is this kind of systematic literature review which was trying to find most of the studies, but and ended up with 8 studies. So that's like not much, right? So we lack data. Also for this. Even though this difference is there, we are not sure what's actually behind it. Why is this difference? There could be partially behavioral responses to heat waves, which are different according to gender. So women tend to do more housework still in Europe, and you cannot actually quit housework much. So they are old and they have a lack of possibility to actually stop working in the household, while men can quit their hobbies like sports activities and so far, right? Women still need to work in the household. No, I'm laughing, but it's seriously taking as one of the explanations. Second one is like more physical differences between men and women, because women, when they get older, they sweat less, so they have a lower ability to cool down the body. Yeah, but anyway, this needs to be more examined in future. Just one example.
Yeah, thank you for that example, because it also shows already the intersectionality, which is also an issue in this area. I think like older women or maybe, I don't know, migrant women, of course, might be more affected in certain countries by the effects of climate change. Of course, social inequalities play a big role. I guess that probably also women who are, or women or men in that case, but who are, for example, homeless, might like what could they do like to stop the effects or limit the effects of climate change on them in overheated cities, for example. So is that also an issue which has been already seen by research and which is covered by research, or is it something relatively new where we still lack data? You already mentioned that we do lack data for Europe, but maybe for the global south, is there more to work with?
In terms of data in the global south? I mean, it's typically a region which is really data scarce, which is then a major problem in this context. I mean, some of the work I do is assessing impacts of climatic like extremes on economic outcomes, and we're trying to develop like databases of subnational economic output, because that's really helpful for assessing the extent of sort of like local floods and things like this. And we have such a hard time getting data for these regions, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where the institutions aren't necessarily there or doing this operations because they don't have the capacity for it. So that's a big challenge, because it means then when you do these global analyses, you're very much biased towards the impacts that you can measure in other countries, and we're missing data in the regions where most likely the vulnerability is highest. So that's a real problem. There is some good data. There's what's called like the DHS survey data, which are surveys conducted in different developing countries over different numbers of years in the same place to assess different aspects of people's livelihoods. And these are really a valuable source of information for assessing impacts on people's livelihoods in developing countries, and also ones related to women's welfare as well. And you were asking first about intersectionality as well, in that regard too. And sort of as I alluded to earlier when talking about the impacts in general on women, I think intersectionality is a major part of it, because I think it's often this access to certain resources, access to certain information that enables people of any gender to have, say, a different response to a climatic shock or to a weather extreme. And typically it's often women who are maybe excluded from certain information, don't have access to it, or don't have the resources financially compared to men. As I mentioned, like 70% of people in poverty are women. And if you don't have access to this information or to these resources, and then there are impacts on your livelihood, you're much less able to adapt and invest in changing your livelihood, invest in moving place. And so intersectionality is a really big part of why there are those discrepancies,
So maybe since we are, we do see finally climate change as a big issue and a big problem to tackle, and these inequalities have been existing for a very long time. Like, might there be some kind of, when we see these two problems and we see that they are strengthening each other, might that maybe lead to a greater readiness also of political actors to act on these two problems. Which brings me, like that's a question I really have on my mind now as you are speaking, and it brings me to a topic I wanted to raise anyway, which is the topic of acceptance of climate policies, and that's something Eva is researching on. So you focus on the acceptance of checks towards climate adaptation and mitigation measures. So what would you say are the most and the least acceptable measures in the Czech society? And is gender and social status, does it also play a role there? Because would you say that female respondents, for example, in surveys, do respond differently, have more acceptance towards certain policies than men, and also people of a different social class, let's say, would be more or less ready to accept climate measures?
So yes, we conduct actually several questionnaire surveys on this topic. One quite recently in summer 2021. We conducted this one in 4 European countries. I will speak mostly about the Czech Republic, because you asked about the Czech Republic, but we can compare with the other countries also a little bit. But there is like similarity. One similarity among European countries in terms of public acceptability of climate policies is support of subsidies and kind of dislike of taxes. There is in general there tend to be like higher acceptability of pull measures and lower of push are exactly like carbon tax or emission trading system, and pull are the subsidies or information provision, etc. So in the Czech Republic, for example, for subsidies for energy efficiency, we have energy saving program, Zelená úsporám, green savings, and this is highly acceptable measure. So like 55% of Czech population was for. Also information provision is really popular, right? Not surprising. Also about 55%. But then also quite popular subsidies for renewable energies, also still above 50% would be for, but then it's declining a lot because then technological standards or standards for energy efficiency or exactly emission trading system or energy taxes, carbon tax tends like to be not so acceptable, but there is mostly like people who are not for or not against. This actually is majority. They like are not against, not for. This is like about 40% of population. And then those who are really for is like about 26% for the taxes. Though the acceptability increases actually when you provide explanation. So we conducted another study for a little bit earlier in 2020, and we actually were asking about carbon tax, and we realized that when you introduce redistribution, that it actually helps a lot to increase the support for the carbon tax. So if you redistribute the money which are collected connected with the tax back to people, for example, by lowering the income tax. By the way, that the original idea of the ecological tax reform was exactly not to increase the revenues for the budget, but to just motivate people to choose something what is environmentally friendly, like environmentally friendly goods, and penalize those goods which are products, services which are not so environmentally friendly, and redistribute actually the revenues back to people by lowering income tax. So or other ways of redistribution, like supporting public transport, for example, or other ways like other environmental programs. Exactly, energy saving program could be like used for the money. Actually, nowadays from emission trading system, the revenues are used for the green savings program. So there is already in the Czech Republic also that kind of redistribution happening, right? There are these differences among the policy measures in terms of acceptability, and they can be actually changed by providing information a little bit. Okay, not suddenly, but continuously and slowly. If there is good policy design which takes into account inequalities, not only socioeconomic, but also based on other differences, like for gender, single mothers, for example, who can be more affected by raising energy taxes, for example. So, if this is taken into account, it also can enhance the public acceptability. And to the second question, if there are differences according to gender, yes. Actually, in general, if you look at the support support for policies, women tend to support slightly more all of the measures. All of the policy instruments which are just mentioned, but just slightly. And this effect disappears when you control for attitudes, okay, climate concern. This is actually explained like this. So women tend to be more concerned, and therefore they tend to have higher acceptability of climate policy instruments. Though it does not hold, of course, in general, because there are some like policy instruments or measures which are less acceptable by women, and these are actually related to nuclear power. So, for example, prolonging life of some nuclear power plant is more supported by men, or building new nuclear power plant more supported by men. So there are exceptions in the support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah, it would make sense how we explained it. Like, women are more affected; they are at least slightly more concerned, and they are more concerned, and they are slightly more accepting of the measures which should limit the effects of climate change. So, yeah, that makes great sense to me. But I wanted to ask also you, Max, because you've been smiling as Eva was talking about the taxations. Can you relate, like, to the British debate, maybe, or was it a different reason why you were smiling?
Nothing about cultural differences. Just, I guess, like common human traits. Like we like to think that we're given an advantage, given a subsidy, given a tax relief or something, rather than having something taken away from us. Yeah, but I completely agree. From what I've seen and read from colleagues' work and things, it really seems like providing information and a redistribution, in particular, of any tax revenue is really, really crucial for making these types of policies acceptable, and in particular when they address pre-existing inequalities, such that they can be deemed sort of equitable as well. But I find it very interesting that the different attitudes of women towards climate change as well, because there's some quite interesting studies I've come across recently, which maybe you could reflect on as well, looking at the extent to which having a gender diverse leadership roles either in companies or in banks affects their sort of green related investment decisions. There were 2 studies by the European Central Bank in the last couple of years actually that were really interesting in this regard, suggesting that banks that have a higher representation of women in their director positions lend more to green firms with lower emissions, even when accounting for sort of other reasons why these types of banks might hire women in the first place, and also that companies that have more women in managerial positions seem to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions at a faster rate, again after accounting for a priori reasons that these companies might hire women, which is, I don't know, it's interesting if it points to some sort of more fundamental behavioral differences between men and women, which mean they maybe have a greater concern about climate change impacts, aside from, like you said, the fact that they're more vulnerable as well, which is, quite interesting.
Yeah, maybe we need more research on that. If that was my impression, that it might be this reasoning, but maybe there are different reasons for that, and maybe we'll see more research about that in the future. But I also wanted to ask you about, because you're researching the economic impacts of climate change and also of maybe taking measures against it versus not taking them. And we are in the Czech Republic. It is a country which economy has been always strongly dependent on industry, especially automotive. And there is a big skepticism towards different sorts of measures, maybe except subsidies, when it comes to fighting climate change. We can see this in politics a lot, but also among the general public. And there is the danger that we just keep doing business as usual and don't do enough. And what economic impacts do you think it might have on a country like Czech Republic, being in the middle of Europe, being a country, as I said, heavily dependent on industry, with maybe not so low incomes again compared to the global south, but rather stagnating level of income. Are there any effects which come to your mind when I say this?
Yeah.
I guess so.
No, it's good to be put up for a question like that that's closely related to what I do. I mean, first of all, I think it's totally reasonable for people to be concerned about their incomes, their jobs in the industries that are important in their countries, whether they're related to the fossil fuel industries or not. I think that's something we have to be aware of and respect in general. But it's super clear from the perspective of climate science, in a physical sense, what the consequences are of not trying to reduce our emissions, not mitigating greenhouse gases, and many of them have consequences for citizens in Europe, some of which we're already starting to feel. So, I mean, some of the obvious consequences are these increasing frequency and intensity of certain extreme weather events, like heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts being the ones with which we have the most confidence that these changes are occurring because of human emissions and that they're already intensifying. And we can already see the effects of those in our lives in a sort of anecdotal sense. I mean, last summer with this heat wave that affected large parts of Europe, this really interrupted a lot of agricultural productivity. And it was within a period of sort of high inflation anyway, because of things like the Russian-Ukrainian war and aftermath of the COVID pandemic. But there's also studies that link these kind of heat wave events to inflationary periods because of the effects on agricultural productivity. And you can see that those are really quite strong actually within Europe already. And that's just sort of one way that this affects the economy. I mean, economic growth itself, something that we maybe think of as being, that's something quite unrelated to climate change. There's a lot of evidence for different impacts of changes in extreme weather events, different aspects of climatic conditions on fundamental economic growth. And if you start to account for these impacts and you try and do some kind of cost-benefit assessments, it's quite clear that these impacts from this increasing frequency of extreme weather events, they quite strongly outweigh the costs required to sort of transform our economy, reduce our emissions. And so the motivation from a sort of general welfare perspective is definitely there from a sort of economic, scientific perspective. It's one that sometimes it's starting to get conveyed more. I think it's definitely clear in sort of the scientific world. It's starting to make its way into the policy world. There've been a few big reports, like a few months ago, actually, by the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate. That's I don't remember because the one is in German. Assessing the economic costs of climate change, specifically on Germany, and finding this same conclusion. So I think we really need to just keep communicating this perspective, and again, this is where the acceptability of policies becomes super relevant to tell people who are in these industries, okay, it's important that we do this transition, and there are going to be policies that assist in making sure that you aren't marginalized during that transition, whether it's through redistribution of income from taxes or reskilling parts of the labor force, so that people in these automotive industries and other similar industries aren't sort of completely left behind. And yeah, it's a very similar situation in Germany in some sense. They have this similar, very strong automotive lobby, very strong automotive industry. But I think it's also possible for them to start framing it as an opportunity as well. I mean, to mitigate climate change, we don't need to think that we just have to like sit down on the floor, do nothing, shut down the economy. It's just like it needs to be a shift, a change, and that can bring with it innovation and actually benefits perhaps in the long run, depending on how we do that.
Eva, do you think this could be a way how to convince also the Czech politicians who are still being in their majority males, so maybe we need more women, and then they might see the need of climate measures more, as we've been discussing before. But do you think the way how Max described it and how he also can show on his data from his research could be a way to change the minds of leading politicians in Czech Republic to invest more in climate mitigation and adaptation measures?
Yeah, the Czech Republic is kind of little bit specific with the high focus on a car industry, right? So there will be the shift now to electric vehicles production, and this is, I think, already happening, right? With Škoda started to produce also electric vehicle. Czech Republic is also specific with this still kind of a really low share of renewable energy in the energy mix, which will need to change if we want to solve, which we want to mitigate climate change, right? So there could be for politicians maybe an argument of creating green jobs by supporting development of renewable energy. And I think politicians can be also persuaded by public opinion, by the way. It's not only lobbyists who go there, hopefully. But also they can already read that there is like a quite large climate concern about Czechs. Majority of population believes in climate change, thinks that the human activity is the cause of the problems. There is already quite high concern. There is just not much knowledge about the ways how to mitigate climate change, like concrete exactly policy measures are not so known, especially in terms of like cost effectiveness of the measures, right? I think this can be also changed by educating and also starting in the schools, which are, in my perspective, also needed more education. I mean, in terms of informing about climate change and impacts and ways how to mitigate climate change. Yeah, so I think these are the maybe ideas.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would like to go more into what we already started discussing a bit, which is representation of women in climate policies, research, like all the areas which are important for change. And I would kick this part off with a quote of Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, who described the international climate negotiations at the COP in Glasgow in 2021 as too male, too pale, and too stale. And I would like to ask you if you think it's still the case. I mean, we are only 2 years after that, so probably not much has changed. But do you see, a positive change towards maybe more equal gender representation in the area of creating climate policies in the decision-making process, in the different bodies which decide and discuss on climate issues, and maybe also in the research? What's your impression? Is there a positive trend or rather not?
I mean, I started speaking a little bit earlier about, I guess, diversity in science in relation to my institute. So maybe I'll pick up there. I spoke to a number of my colleagues who are women before coming here because I wanted to get some like good input from them as well. And like I mentioned, I think at this level of science, which I guess is where most of the debate regarding climate change should ideally begin, is at this scientific level. There has obviously historically been large underrepresentation of women in science for a long time, and at our institute, at least at this PhD level, it's now roughly 50-50, which is great, but there still seem to be these barriers to progressing up the sort of scientific hierarchy, which is when it becomes really important for policy dialogue. Essentially, it's not the PhD students who go and have an engagement with policymakers or other people. It's the people who are higher up. And yeah, I mean, the sort of obvious barriers are I think. Again, the roles and responsibilities that women have in our society still here in the West. Like, I mean, the really obvious one when I speak to my colleagues or supervisors is like their concerns about if they want to have a family, if they want to have a child, the idea of having, say, like a year where they're not publishing research, that's like in the scientific field, like kind of damaging to your credentials, because you're constantly assessed on your publication record, and so that's often a conflict of interests and something that's quite difficult to resolve. In the policy sphere, I can't comment. I've not engaged enough there. But I think it's interesting to look in, say, the sphere of like of activism, for example, which maybe has some like relationship into the policy sphere and outside of the scientific sphere, because it really seems that a lot of the major figureheads of climate activist movements are women and young women. I mean, Greta Thunberg, and in Germany, Luisa Neubauer, really like leading these kind of movements. And that's an interesting arena where women seem to really have like a good level of representation. But then it also comes with particular challenges as well. Like they're facing like really difficult, essentially like abuse, like hate messages and things, which are often like sexualized despite their like really young ages on social media and things. So that's quite an interesting arena as well outside of the scientific area, where I think there's maybe better progress in some sense, but it comes with these other issues. And some of my colleagues as well have experienced things like that as well by being sort of prominent in the presentation of their scientific work.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying also about activism, because we have conducted and published also a study on gender and intersectionality in the climate movement in Czech Republic, the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And we have one of the authors here in the room, as I see, so maybe we can also discuss that later. But that actually showed, like, it was not a statistics, so it was rather interviews showing that women who are active in the climate movement, even though it's a sphere which is very much more aware about gender and about the necessity to have more diversity, still you have like many older experts around who are in the rather visible positions in that movement. And it's harder for the women to move towards these positions, even though there are many as well. So what would you say, Ivan, maybe not about activism, but whatever you like either in the research field in the Czech Republic or policy making? Is there any progress? Are there any measures how to change the situation, or is it still a problem which hasn't been seen, or where solutions are still not in place?
I think just following up what you said about the NGOs, I saw just a brief comparison of the representation of women among NGOs in comparison to other spheres, and NGOs were quite doing in Europe quite good, better than for example corporate boards. Though I see for corporate boards now for good signs, because European Union is started to have an binding idea that they would actually motivate companies to increase the participation of women on corporate boards. There is, I think, lots of happening which comes from European Commission or European Union in general. There is now the European strategy on gender equality, so and that might be helpful. There is the EU Gender Action Plan for 2021 to 2025. They start to be idea gender mainstreaming. They are already supposed to be part of the EU funds. So for gender budgeting also is an improvement going in this direction. So I see many good signs that something has been changing. So it's just matter of time when it will arrive to the Czech Republic. Observing how this past experiences make me think that there is quite high probability that it will also arrive here.
Let's be hopeful on that. I think also you said Max, you don't want to comment the policy making field, but in the development cooperation, which you also it is also an issue you're dealing with in your work. I do see certain tendencies like feminist development policy. Germany has also introduced this. Also internationally, it is an issue, no? To look into the needs of women on the one side and the vulnerabilities that they are facing, but on the other hand, to go to women, to maybe have extra funds for women, also in the context of climate change, because they are finally not only seen as the possible victims of climate change, but also as actors who can really actually much better act and change things than if we only let men do the job. So do you see that, and can you maybe tell a bit more?
Yeah, no, I can comment on it. You're definitely right. Well, I think particularly if looking to other countries outside of Europe and trying to engage with say countries in the developing world in relation to issues of representation of gender and in issues of differential vulnerability to impacts of climate change from gender, the best thing that we can do is not to sort of prescribe policies to these places, essentially partly because these issues are so intersectional and so localized based on different local conditions that we're not in the best place to do it. And so what you're kind of describing, this way to empower local people, local women to engage in these decision-making processes, that's really the most effective thing that we can do. What was the initiative you mentioned? Was it the feminist foreign policy initiative?
There's the feminist foreign policy, but there's also the feminist development policy.
Yeah.
So these both actually ideally probably in interaction could be. a good step forward.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the feminist foreign policy, they have like their 3 R's. It's like rights, encouraging rights and representation, and something else of women in decision-making processes in foreign countries when engaging with them through diplomacy. And I think that's like the best thing we can do in that regard in relation to foreign countries. There's some other interesting stuff at the EU level as well, because I mean a really big initiative now for them in relation to climate change is the Green New Deal. This which is still being worked on and proposed, but this is essentially like a growth plan for the EU that addresses in environmental issues. And there's recent calls from like the European Committee of Regions, which is sort of like an advisory body based on more regionalized governments, to really include like gender issues in those proposals and things like that. So yeah, definitely these things appear to start to be coming into the more mainstream policy discussions. Maybe not mainstream, but yeah, they're being brought into the discussions at least. Yeah, but I guess I meant that I didn't really feel like I could answer in terms of representation of women in policy spheres, because I don't have I'm not there. Yeah.
Don't worry. So let's hope that on national, European, and also global level, we will see more such initiatives and more improvement. But now I would, because since we've been talking for a long time and addressing many issues here, just the 3 of us, I would now like to ask our audience to raise questions which you might have, which might have occurred during our debate. So please just, if you have a question, raise your hand. Ideally, maybe stand up. We have a microphone there, so it would be great to grab the microphone so that we can all hear you well.
Perfect. Can I not stand up? Is that okay?
Okay.
So my question is just about, I guess, kind of data and motivation, because we've been speaking a lot about intersectionality. So it's kind of a 2-parter. The first one is there a lot of, I guess, disaggregated data being collected along the sort of intersectional line, so in terms of disability, but then, as you said, migrant women and all of the other sort of intersections that are happening, is that data being collected? And then the second part of the question is, if we have that data and if it's being taken seriously and if it's motivating the action that we need to actually happen. So I guess a bit of context would be useful, but I was in another discussion here in Prague about, I guess, what's happening in developing countries and the fact that they're on the front lines of the crisis, and if that in itself is enough to motivate people to want to act because it's not happening here in this country. So it's a very messy question, but it's more like, are we collecting that data? And even if we are, is it enough to instigate change?
Thanks for the great question. Maybe it goes directly to Maximilian, but either of us. No, it goes to both of the panelists. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I can start. Maybe it's a bit more related to the stuff I spoke about in developing countries. There has been data collected along these like intersectional lines. Like I mentioned, some of the data that I've worked with in this context is like survey data run by this institute, DHS, and there's a set of specific information that's related to like women's welfare, women's health outcomes, which is also like matched to other dimensions, mainly socioeconomic, like working conditions, levels of income. I don't think much on disability, not that I know of. And that's a really helpful like data source that goes back, say, for the last like 20 years. But I think often like the issue with data availability and stuff as well is that as new topics become available or start to gain interest, so maybe say disability, for example, there's such a time lag between interest in those topics and then actually setting up the infrastructure to start gathering that data, and then waiting long enough to have enough data to do something with is then like such a issue that there's inevitably still going to be like gaps along many of these questions that are really interesting. Some of the stuff that's maybe a bit more promising is sort of slightly less traditional forms of data. Like typically, like survey-based data is really useful, and still definitely is. It allows you to ask really detailed questions, get a sense of people at really this individual level. But particularly in developing countries where maybe there's like big data gaps in general, using sort of things like satellite data to try and infer things that we can't otherwise, definitely not really applicable to certain like very high dimensional specific things like disabilities or even really women's outcome. But for, say, constructing things like socioeconomic variables in areas where we don't necessarily have that information, we can start to look to sources like satellite data to give us some kind of intuition about these things, or also increasingly like digital data. And for things like disability or the experience of different groups, that's actually potentially really powerful, and that's a really growing research area of starting to use this kind of information, whether it's from ideally like anonymized, so not like peering into people's lives, but using data from, say, social media or like search engine requests, map data, to really see the response of individuals when they're not being asked about it, but when they're unprompted, just doing and responding to whatever, say, the impacts of climate change. Yeah, that's really potentially powerful sources. But again, it's only becoming recently more available with the advent of like digitalization and this kind of thing. And then your second question was really about whether even with that data, was it whether that would be enough, being able to answer these questions to sort of convince us to take action here in the more developed world? Yeah. Oh, well, that's a difficult question. It depends how altruistic we are as a society, right? I would be pessimistic and say that people are still very self-interested. And so for me, I think a lot of the motivation for dealing with climate change has to come from the emphasis we can place on the benefits for the people who are living in the countries where those decisions are being made. And ultimately, that still, if we do that, and if that works, that still has the important benefits for the people in these other countries. Like the greenhouse gas emissions we emit in the West, in Europe, they ultimately affect extreme weather events across the whole world in all of these different developing countries. And so that's my feeling. But yeah, I think there should be an interest in the risks of all the people across the world that people are exposed to. And I mean, maybe Eva has different perspectives on that, having looked into more of these different like behavioral responses, preferences for different policies. But I would be a bit pessimistic about the effectiveness of an emphasis on impacts in different regions and different people on our own sort of local policy.
Do you want to add anything? Otherwise?
Yeah, maybe for Europe, we have now the European Institute for Gender Equality. There is a nice set of data on gender differences. Maybe whether we elaborating on what you were just trying to say, whether Europe will actually change the actions. Yeah, we have lots of already climate policies. General, we are having targets quite good, right? Climate neutrality for the EU by 2050. Though I don't see so much progress in achieving these targets, but hopefully it will come.
It's even more pessimistic than mine answer.
No, this was optimism. Because only having the target actually is a good thing and can lead us somewhere, right? Because without the target, we even don't know where to go. So I think it's great and it's actually getting better when I observe it. 10 years ago, it was even not such an target. The targets were much less ambitious. Now we have quite ambitious targets, which is actually a signal for the society, whole society, households, companies mostly, that they can count on some future development in this direction. So I think, yes, it hopefully will improve.
Thanks for the portion of Czech climate optimism. And but yeah, it's maybe realism more. But let's give the audience an opportunity for some more questions.
So thanks a lot for the interesting discussion. I have a lot of thoughts in my mind, and finally I managed to formulate a question, and that's on gender inequality in the climate measures, because you were talking about the impacts of climate change, but my question would be, I mean, thankfully now there is already a lot of money flowing into climate measures and decarbonization and so on, but I was wondering, is there any report or data on how those measures impact men and women? Because my guess would be that even though women on balance are impacted more by climate change, somehow the money that is flowing into the solutions benefits more men in the end, because like there are solutions preferred that deal with problems that impact men more than women. So yeah, any thoughts or data on that?
I think it's a really great point. Yes, we actually need to take care of this and do proper modeling of this. Like macroeconomic modeling, but also like some simulations. And for example, looking at transport, right? We have quite nice data on transport mode choices from Transport Research Center, quite recent one, and there is clearly possible to see the difference. 48% of men travel by car, while women 30%, right? That's a large difference. Also, looking at walking, 42% of the journeys were by walking by women, while men walked only 29% of the journeys by men were by walking, so by foot. So we can actually really think about how to promote the sustainable transport transformation, because electric vehicle subsidies, for example, could change part of the emissions. Can lead to some reductions of the emissions, but we will need to actually calculate properly how it will impact different genders, for example, and how we can actually promote more sustainable transport solutions, which would also help women more. So for exactly for public transport, infrastructure for cycling, walking, especially. Also, women do more journeys, so because they need to still take care of relatives, children, right? So they do much more of these journeys by combining this kind of transport, which are different than car. So yes, we need to model this. Is one example. For energy, single mothers are especially having quite large difficulties with the budget after the increase of the prices of energies, but we can tackle this with focused, specific subsidies directed to redistribution to the vulnerable groups, right? So the segments which we exactly know that would be more like affected by the policies.
So if I understand you right, it's not happening. It's not been taken into account that the behavior and the needs of women and of vulnerable groups might be different from the majority or from, let's say, from men, and there is no targeted funding towards these groups, or the policies are not being set up to their needs also, or is there anything in place?
Yes, they are, right. Some of social benefits going to, for example, the single mothers, right? That's happening somehow, but we need maybe to at if we come with some type of climate policy, which would lead maybe to having some negative impact on their finances more. So if doing climate policy, I think we need to do proper modeling of the distributional impacts.
Are there some examples from maybe Germany, Europe, or internationally, which are taking this more into account, these differences between women and men and different needs they have?
I think echoing what Eva said in terms of the redistribution element of climate policy specifically, like she said, there are some policies already that address these pre-existing inequalities between men and women, but I'm not aware of any in terms of relating climate policies and their distributional effects and trying to sort of rectify those. There's a lot of research on redistribution of climate policy revenue, for example, to different income groups. I've not seen anything on gender, and that's just in the research sphere, so I'm not aware of anything that's currently implemented. No.
Could you name like maybe two things which would need to happen in near future, let's say the next 5 years, to substantially change the fact that climate change has much bigger effect on women and on vulnerable groups? Like what would be the things you would like to see to change that would really have an effect on this?
Maybe I will start with gender budgeting. Because lots of public finance are going to some specific segments, and I think we really need to go this systematically and do like a really good review where the public money goes. And when we design policies, take into account the gender differences since beginning, when first the data are collected, to look at the differences among the segments, socioeconomic segments, but also gender differences. And then when the policy is being formulated, it needs to be exactly evaluated where the money will go and how the money will help or not to reduce the inequalities.
Gender budgeting, okay. What about you, Maximilian?
Maybe I'll focus my answer because this was more to do with unequal effects of, say, like mitigation policies and things. Maybe I'll talk more again about the impact side and policies to reduce inequalities in the impacts of climate change. And there I would say that probably the best way, the most sure way to reduce the vulnerability of women to impacts from climate change is just to limit the impacts of climate change. That's the most sure way to do it across the board. And I think that might seem stupid and simplistic, but particularly when the different impacts in different regions and different contexts differ so much dependent on the local context, the most effective policy to address all of these different potential heterogeneities of impacts and differential impacts in different regions is just to reduce the underlying driver. So for me, I would still go back just to the emphasis on near-term reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and for this the main emphasis I think would be coal phase out, to be honest. So that's maybe not what you wanted to hear, but I think that's probably the thing that I would emphasize in relation to the impacts of climate change. Yeah.
Thanks for the clear answers to two measures which we would like to see in place. Is there, meanwhile, a last question that we could take in? Yes, I see one hand in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe coming back to kind of developing countries and comparing to the EU per se. So I would maybe like to ask that we see what's going on, that it's way worse in the developing countries. We are not really doing anything about it. We are just trying to get more and more data. So do you think that as the developed world, or more specifically as the EU, should we take straight action in the developing world? Or are we waiting for Brussels effect in this sense? Or what should we do, or what are we doing in this sense?
I mean, I think it's a really important question, and it was such a big topic at the recent COP discussions all of the recent COP discussions, but in particular the most recent one in relation to like loss and damage funds, which has been so it's this proposal that the wealthy countries which are most historically responsible for climate change but are least vulnerable to them, so typically in the developed global north, these countries should try to provide financing for countries in the global south who are more vulnerable and less responsible for climate change. So in that regard, there is sort of some progress that's been made, at least in these kind of political discussions. The reaffirmation of a commitment to develop such funds, and that's really, really important. But it's interesting as well. I mean, when I think about the problem of climate change in general, I think it's almost a shame to shift the emphasis to financing for the impacts that are going to occur and are happening, rather than financing to stop the emissions in the first place and stop the phenomenon. It's kind of like the difference between curing an illness at its base or just sort of like dealing with the symptoms, right? And it's interesting that in those COP discussions there was definitely good progress made on this loss and damage in this loss and damage area, but there was quite a lot of weakening, as there often is, but with regards to statements related to actual greenhouse gas emissions, so the steps needed to sort of treat the underlying illness. So, I mean, as scientists, yeah, we're limited in what we can do. Maybe all we can do is collect data and like do these studies to suggest these things. But I think there is then action starting to happen, such as these discussions at a political level, to address those global inequalities, which are definitely part of the discussion, definitely very much on the agenda there politically.
Okay, thank you very much. It's time for us to conclude, and I'm happy that we also moved from describing the inequalities and the reasons for them towards also policies and possible solutions in this debate. So thank you a lot for your brilliant answers and insights you have offered us from your research and beyond. And thanks to the public as well for your great questions and your involvement and your interest in this topic. I think we can maybe continue a bit in our exchange also here in this room, because there will be a little buffet which is awaiting you, so you might stay a bit and continue exchanging with the panelists or with each other. Thanks to the German Embassy for organizing this event and bringing up this topic, and also to Campus Hybernska for the great premises we could use. And I hope that we will continue in this debate in future, and also will be able to state that progress has been made. So thank you for being here, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
It's also my pleasure to thank also the German Embassy, the organizers, and also our excellent panelists and excellent moderator. It was a pleasure being with you. And now I have the last wish to both panelists. Could you kindly add your signature to our wall of fame? And again, you are cordially invited. And don't forget also the SDGs exhibition, but please download your application. Thank you for being with us this evening, and look forward to meeting you again at the next Café Collaborations.